Hey everyone, we are live. We are going to take a little bit of time to wait for other folks to show up. And so we might just give it a few more minutes before we start the presentation. So thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, and a little housekeeping, you'll notice on the right-hand side, there is a panel, a Q&A panel. If you don't see it, it should look like a question mark and a couple of message boxes. So if you click that, that is where you can submit your questions throughout the event, and we'll try to answer them as they come in, either live or through text. But if we don't get to them, just know that there will be time at the end of the presentation and we'll address those. So we can get started here, Alex. I just wanted to mention that if you're having internet problems today, or if you need to drop off for a call, this presentation is being recorded and we will be sending out a link to the recording and some other resources post-event. So keep an eye out for that. And awesome. Yeah, take it from here, Alex.
Sounds good. Thanks, Vanessa. So my name is Alex Fields. I'm a Microsoft MVP, which basically means that I have like a part-time job for Microsoft that they don't pay me for, but I get paid in compliments and other things, so it's not all bad. And plus, I'm a giant nerd, so I love it anyways. In addition to my role at Success Computer Consulting, I also have a blog at IT Pro Mentor. I spend a fair amount of time on that, and there's a lot of helpful resources for you there as well. Particularly if you're in the small and mid-sized market, I think you may find that a helpful resource. So today I want to talk a little bit about managing the collaboration experience in Microsoft 365. The agenda today it will advance. First, what is Microsoft 365 in its essence, and why do people want to customize it? By way of this, we're really going to be focusing on the collaboration experiences, not so much like Exchange Online, but definitely OneDrive, SharePoint, and Teams. And then at the end, we're going to also have a helpful, customization and governance checklist. And this is a resource that I developed as actually I developed this with Microsoft a little while back, and they have a version of it on their site as well. It was particularly in response to the the situation with COVID and being able to get people up and running on Teams and collaboration quickly. And giving them some guidance about some of the things that they may want to consider when they're doing that. So I've taken that, I've kind of kept developing it and modifying it as I've had a few engagements with customers now over the last couple of months. And so this is the latest iteration, and it's included with this presentation. So we'll send a link out to that as well. So what is Microsoft 365? Well, is it consumer apps that you buy and use, or business apps that you build and iterate? And of course, the answer is C, it's both A and B. And the reality is that a lot of organizations just buy Microsoft 365 and just use it, sort of like you would other applications like Dropbox or Evernote or something. But you may be missing some of the value if all you do is just buy and use it, just like it's a consumer app. And there are consumer versions of the Microsoft 365 apps, and it's in some ways a shame if businesses only treat it that way, because they usually miss out on a lot of the goodness. What makes Microsoft 365 so different is that you can customize it, And so I like to say, that Microsoft 365 is the clay and governance is the shape into which you will fashion it. So that's the means by which you can tell the system how to work for you. Now, whenever I have engagements where we're going through, a Microsoft 365 adoption and a deployment, I usually have two types of customers. The first type is, they have no idea what they want to do, and that's probably even the most common. They're just like, I just need to get email in the cloud, and I don't want to have a server anymore, and I don't know what to do other than that. I just don't want to have a server, something like that. Then there's a second type of customer that thinks they know what they want to do, or at least they have an opinion, about why they want a system to look a certain way or to behave a certain way. And so we'll talk about that. First, to begin with type 1 customers, I can always identify these folks because they say things like, what do you recommend? Can you just build it for me? And what's the best practice? I have to laugh at these just a little bit because the reality, there's maybe a couple of small things you could call best practice, right? Like these days you have to have multi-factor. That's not really optional anymore. If you're not doing that, you need to be doing it. So outside of that, though, there's really not such a thing as a best practice, but you can end up with the wrong practice by failing to define what you want out of the system, right? If you don't get the experience that you want, or it's not behaving the way you'd like it to, it's probably because you didn't do a good job of telling it what you want to begin with. And there's a lot you can make it do if you only knew where to go. Now, the way I identify type 2 customers, there's type 2 customers have other subtypes, and this is the more complicated one. The type 2 customers are, again, the ones who they have an opinion about what they want. Now, with regard to this first category, I have specific internal or external security and compliance requirements. Cool, I can work with you on this all day long, and it usually just involves changes to the system. And when you make changes to the system, it's going to result in some changes to human behavior in some cases, like people are going to run into walls or barriers and they can't do certain things, or they have to be sure to apply their compliance labels or do whatever they need to do, right? But we can work with this. Like, this is something that I can, say, yes, let's just go through the requirements that you have. Let's make the adjustments we need to make so that you can meet these requirements. No problem. But there's this group number 2. I want it to behave more like what I'm used to. And this one is not really about changes to the system. It's about changes to people. Usually this is like, okay, we got to work on digital transformation here. If you want Microsoft 365 to behave like your old file server, you're completely missing the point. And I can't fault you for it. A lot of people don't like to change, but the truth of it is that if you try to treat the new world like the old one, you're just going to end up with more problems, and you're going to feel more pain because of that. It's already not that great in the old world, and then to apply that to technology that's not really built for that is, silly. So we do have to work on changing some attitudes there, and that's a lot harder, honestly, than the first one. And then there's this third category where, sometimes they want to maintain more control or remove, certain features from the end user's view, and this is really difficult because there's totally legitimate reasons why you may want to maintain some control, or maybe release features to users at a planned pace or something. But often I find that number 3 mask is really just number 2. It's masquerading as, almost like they're masquerading as number 1 in some cases, but it's really number 2 in disguise. So you kind of have to have a little bit of a, you got to be keen to this. You got to be tuned in to what they're really asking. Are you really just asking to take away these features because you're not comfortable with them, you don't know what they are, and you really just want it to be more like your old file server? So yeah, this is just something to be aware of when we're having these engagements. Sometimes I'm fishing for this. But yeah, number 1 we can do all day long. Now, as we move through, I just want to, what I'm going to highlight is really it's going to be focused on number 1. We'll talk a little bit maybe about some of the removing certain features from end users view and when you might want to do that, but mostly I'll be focused on, meeting, external and internal security and compliance requirements. That's usually the easiest one to approach, and this is more of a checklist thing, whereas changes to the people, that's a whole other topic that's a little bit more difficult. Maybe you find some useful content in our end user, user group the following day or something. But as far as changes to the system, I can talk about that all day long. All right, so OneDrive and SharePoint. How do we manage these scary new sharing experiences in the cloud? When it comes to OneDrive, and this applies to SharePoint as well for the most part, but the concerns people will usually say is users can get to their files from anywhere now. Sharing is scary, right? Can't we just turn off external sharing? I don't like the idea of people sending sharing links out, beyond the walls of the organization. And then there's this thought that I can't see what people are doing in their own OneDrive. I mean, that's like their own storage space, and they have all these rights there, and they can just invite people to files. I have no idea what's going on. And so they feel like they don't have enough control. It's giving too much control to the end user. So we hear that concern as well. The replies to these concerns is, number 1, OneDrive is an application that you control. And so, unlike a lot of other, shadow IT apps, Dropbox and the like, which users are going to go use anyways if you're not going to give them a tool, you have visibility here. So you absolutely can see what's going on, and you can apply certain controls to it. And with regards to, this concern around sharing links, people send emails all day long, and oftentimes they're sending attachments in those emails. And once an attachment leaves the walls of your organization, you don't have any idea what happens with that data, right? I mean, they could have been forwarding it to other people, taking it, reusing it, whatever. You don't know what they're doing with it. But if you use a sharing link, you're inviting someone to come collaborate in your house, right? According to the rules that you laid down. And so that's a lot more powerful, and it eliminates the back and forth versioning and all kinds of other stuff. So you really should not be afraid of external sharing. And whenever I hear people say they want to turn external sharing off, I always question that. I'm like, how do you, if you don't want to share with people, how are you in business, right? At some point you have to share information with other people. So don't turn off sharing links. Okay, and then this last one, I just want to point out that you have a lot of options for management, and there's auditing too. And so anything that we're talking about here with regards to OneDrive for Business, even though I'm starting with that, just know that most of the things we're going to talk about here will also apply to SharePoint and Teams. So I'll just start with the simple stuff, managing OneDrive per user in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. Now you probably notice, if any of you have worked in here before, if you're in the active users area, you click on a user, and on the far right, you'll see that we can pick OneDrive, and you get a few controls with regard to this person's OneDrive. So for example, at any time, if you want to go in there and see what's going on, or you need to help them find something or retrieve a file or get a version back or whatever, if you're providing support in any way, or they've departed the organization and now you need to get access to those and give that access to someone else or anything, you can create a link to that as an admin, and you can go into anyone's OneDrive. You can also, monitor how much storage they're using. We'll talk about that a little bit more later as well. And then, there's these external sharing controls. So we're also going to touch on in some future slide about global sharing settings, but just know that you can come in and, on a per user basis control, whether, for example, they're allowed to use anonymous links where they can send links where people don't have to authenticate, or you can change that so they're required to authenticate. You can completely turn it off, or you can just allow sharing, within the organization if they just don't have a job role that requires external sharing, and they're basically just an internal resource. So you can control this on a per user basis. You don't have to, knock it down for the whole organization. And in addition to that, this is kind of confusing in my opinion. They have these, it says OneDrive settings for your organization, so it's like labeled appropriately, but I think having it on the user card like this could be a little confusing. You might think that, oh, I can just change the data retention or the storage space for this particular user, but that's not really true. If you click any of these links, it just takes you to the OneDrive Admin Center and you're making global changes here, okay? Now, an interesting thing to note about the storage space that you get with OneDrive, it is 1 terabyte by default for most plans. However, certain qualifying enterprise plans, that is plans that will include OneDrive for Business Plan 2 in the bundle, if you have more than 5 users in your environment, you can extend that up to 5 terabytes per user. Okay, so this doesn't work with the business plans, but for the enterprise plans, you can actually go all the way up to 5 terabytes. Now, 1 terabyte is already a ton of data, and you'll most likely, a lot of your users will never hit that, but it is pretty cool to know that that's there. And then the other thing is that when a user departs the organization and their user account gets deleted, you can keep that OneDrive data around for a while if you need to. And it's 30 days by default, but you can extend this up to 10 years if you want to. So just be aware of that as well. Now, we touched on the fact that you can modify sharing settings, individually for users and stuff. And that can be useful information. So let's take a look at the global sharing settings. They're in 2 places. You're going to see kind of these same options, like this is in the OneDrive Admin Center. But these options are identical to what we have in the SharePoint Admin Center, and there's actually a few more dials that you get there. So I almost never use the OneDrive Admin Center in practice for this. I'll just do it from the SharePoint. And yeah, we'll just take a quick look at some of these. Now, the very first thing here, this sliding bar up and down where we have most permissive to least permissive. The first thing to remember is that you can never set OneDrive at a more permissive level than SharePoint. So if you wanted SharePoint to require new and existing guests, in other words, they have to sign in, and you can't use anonymous links, you couldn't then leave OneDrive using anonymous links. And so what the thing with this is that I actually usually encourage people to consider keeping anyone links on, only because they are an extremely easy way to share files. Because there's no authentication required, people can just click the link, get the file, get into the file, so it can make things really convenient. And not all the data you work with is highly sensitive, and a lot of times you do just want ease of use. And remember that it's also possible to control on a per site level. So if you needed to further restrict sharing, on an individual SharePoint site or library, by all means, you can knock it down all the way to only allow sharing in the organization. Just turn off external sharing. You could certainly do that on an internal only library, a confidential library. But in general, I usually encourage people to stay liberal with this unless they have a need because of an outside compliance requirement. They're, whether they need to follow some laws, whether they're basically 100% of the data they work with, like their main contract is with the Department of Defense or something, and we do actually have a customer like that. They have to bring this down, to new and existing guests because they're required to have an audit trail that can identify who accessed files and when. So that's when you would drop this down, at a global level. But you can also control this per site and per user. So just remember that. Now, the last 2 down here, existing guests or only people in your organization, I would argue you should rarely be using those, especially at a global level. And the reason is that, like I said, if you're not, how are you in business if you're not sharing information with folks? That doesn't make sense. And with the existing guest setting, that means that like an admin has to provision every guest you're going to share with, which also isn't very scalable and very practical. So typically the choices you're making at the global level is kind of between that, should we allow anonymous links, which are extremely easy to access, or should we, require that audit trail, but rarely what I see is someone on the global level using one of these other two settings. If you have that, you might have done something wrong. Okay, now there's a bunch of settings down here that you can go further. You can like limit external sharing by domain, or just use a specific security group where people are allowed to share externally. But there's this one setting that I want to draw your attention to because it is the default setting and orgs rarely want this. So this is where, in your organization, you're responsible for developing certain content and sharing it outside the organization. But it's rare that orgs actually want guests to then also have the share button so that they can choose to share it with some other person. Like, I'm okay sharing this information with you, but I don't necessarily want you to share it with someone else. And so if you don't want guests to have that sharing button experience, and like if you're inviting them into your OneDrive or your SharePoint to co-author with something, and you want to turn that off, just be aware that you should come here to do that. That is a default setting. This is also in the OneDrive Admin Center where you can kind of choose what's the default link. When I click the share button, like what gets generated automatically. And the default, of course, is anyone with the link, so an anonymous link with edit permissions. So if you don't like that selection and you want it to be like only people in your organization or specific people or something, you can come here and adjust that. And then as well, down below here, you'll see that if you choose to keep any one links on, you also have more control with that. So unlike an email where you're sending an attachment and it goes away and you never see it again and you have no control over that, with an anyone link, you can maintain some control. You can require those links to expire, okay? And you can choose whether people are, if they're using anonymous links, can they use it to send out edit and upload capability and stuff, or should it just be to share information like one way? Like I'm just sending you this to view. You can view this data, but you can't, change it. So you can still mitigate some of the risks that are perceived to be there with anyone links. I still believe that they're better than an email because you're inviting someone into your organization, even if they're coming in anonymously. That's still better in a lot of ways than just sending an email out into the ether and never knowing what happens. There's some settings down below. I usually leave them as default. You can review them in your own time if you like, but I tend to think they're fine. Now, there's this one other area with regard to external collaboration I want to draw your attention to. It's not, they don't put it anywhere in the SharePoint or OneDrive Admin Center, but it does have impacts on that experience. It's in the Azure Active Directory Admin Center. So if you come to Azure AD External Identities and find External Collaboration Settings, there's a really helpful feature here. It's in preview now, so that just means if you turn it on, be aware that they could change the experience slightly or something before it goes to general availability. But it's a highly valuable one. So this is a one-time passcode for guests, and if you turn this on, it just means that they don't, like, someone who you're inviting to a file doesn't necessarily have to sign in with a Microsoft account. Now in the past, they would have had to have a Microsoft account. They either would have had to be a 365 customer themselves, or they would have had to sign in with some other Microsoft identity like a Live account or an Xbox account or whatever, Hotmail, all those things that Microsoft owns. But that sometimes can add friction because if a person doesn't have a Microsoft account yet, they have to go provision one and blah, 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 blah. So what this looks like, if you turn this experience on, you can be invited using a secure link. This doesn't apply to anonymous links because you just click those and you come right in. But if you're using a secure link, you have to identify who you are. And here's how it works. So I've got my Gmail up here, and I've sent myself from a demo tenant this file, and you'll see here this only works for direct recipients of the message. Okay, so it's not an anonymous link. And if I click open, then I'm taken to the file. But before I can get access, I have to send myself a passcode, and we'll just send it to the email that this was sent to me at, itpromentor@gmail.com. So I'll click on send code, and boom, there it is. I just have to copy that, paste it in here, and then verify. And that I'm brought to the file. And you'll notice in the upper right corner here, it identifies me as IT ProMentor, which means that in my audit log, it says, this identity, this person accessed this file at this date and time. Whereas if you were sending an anonymous link, it would literally say in the audit log and be like, anonymous user accessed this file or whatever. So this is a way where if you are going to take away that any one link functionality, consider adding that one-time passcode feature because it does make the login experience a little smoother for folks. It's pretty streamlined, pretty straightforward, and a process I think a lot of people are probably familiar with from other apps and stuff.
Alex, we do have one question from the audience.
Sure.
In the SharePoint settings, be administered by library.
By site, yeah. So at the site level, you can modify those sharing settings. And so maybe I'll just rewind backwards really quickly to, okay, so I don't have it expanded here, but if you were to click on sites, then you'll see active sites. And you click on active sites. If you select a site, then you can edit its sharing settings. So yes. Thanks. Okay, so the recipient experience, we went through that, and next we were going to talk about access controls. And this is one of the most important ways that you can control the experience that users have with these applications, as well as protecting the data. Okay, so you can make decisions that help you really take a strong handle around that data and make sure that you don't have leakage into unapproved areas that you don't control. And so good idea to pay attention to this, especially if you have a high level of risk concern in your environment. You're dealing with a lot of sensitive data, you know, day in, day out, and you're used to keeping that in your file server, and people have to use the VPN to get in. But hey, you know, by the way, they're sending it out over email all the time and stuff, so it's not that secure. Okay, we'll go through some of these. First of all, you can control the sync capability. Okay, now with regard to almost any subscription, they give you a few things here in the OneDrive Admin Center where you can basically take the sync button away from OneDrive. You can also allow the OneDrive client to only sync on specifically joined domains. So you can have you have to get your domains GUID and put it in there, and only certain, you know, people or whatever who have a managed workstation would be able to join this. But these are kind of, I would say these are old methods of doing this, and they're not as strong as conditional access. So the preferred vehicle for accomplishing this today is conditional access, and that's what we're going to focus on. This is a feature that's available in Azure Active Directory Premium Plan 1, which is included in all of the major Microsoft 365 plans from Microsoft 365 Business Premium on up to E3, E5, and so forth. So those are the ones you want to focus on for getting this conditional access feature, which is a key way of controlling your security and compliance in the cloud. Similarly, under the device access area here in the OneDrive Admin Center, which also corresponds to an area we'll look at in the SharePoint Admin Center, these things are available. Like you can block access from everywhere except specific IP addresses. You can also disable modern authentication, or sorry, you can disable basic authentication and force the use of modern authentication. But you know, if you don't have that premium plan, you can't do it with conditional access. Then I highly recommend coming in here and disabling this feature, because that's going to be on by default. Soon Microsoft will have this turned off by default, but right now you'd have to come in and do this. It's a highly important thing to do though, because leaving your basic authentication open, it does leave you open to some, I believe, unnecessary risks. When most folks are using modern client apps today that support modern authentication, they should you know, close down the gates on any of those older applications. Now there's this other feature that you'll find here, and I've seen a lot of people who have been poking around and just turning this stuff on. This is not the right place to turn this on. It's a highly powerful feature. It's called Mobile Application Management, or MAM. But if you apply this through the OneDrive Admin Center, it's literally only applying to OneDrive, and it doesn't play with the other apps, and it is actually going to create a worse user experience than if you do it the right way, and which we'll talk about as well. So back in the SharePoint Admin Center, this area corresponds to what we were just looking at for the most part. Again, you can block the basic auth, you can, you know, restrict by IP address, and if you make changes, whether you make them in here in the SharePoint Admin Center or you make them in the OneDrive Admin Center, you're making the same change, so they'll be reflected in both places. They just give you a couple different windows to get into it. But there's a couple other items here, like idle session timeout. So you know, after people have been inactive for a while, you can have them automatically sign out. You can also kind of control the sign-in experience with conditional access. We'll talk about that. And then this unmanaged device area, this actually is creating conditional access policies in the background, and this is not open to you if you don't have a compatible subscription. But this is, again, this right here, we're going to dial into this a little bit deeper, because this is a really, really highly powerful control. So what this does is, you know, by default, first of all, it's full access. Everyone has full access from anywhere. You can use a desktop app like OneDrive client. You can use the web browser, and you can get full access and full download capability from everywhere. But you also have the ability to limit this. So you can limit the access and not allow files to be downloaded or synced on unmanaged devices. So they have to be managed by your organization, or they can't get the data out of the cloud and down onto their device. You can also just choose to block access outright. With limited web-only access, they can still visit the files on the web, they can still interact with them and edit them right in the web page in OneDrive or SharePoint Online using Word or Excel or whatever for the online versions, but they can't, again, bring it down to the desktop. Here you can just block access and just say, sorry, you're not allowed to have access on an unmanaged device, period. Now, again, these are global settings, so just be aware of that. Like, you can also block this per site. There's not a graphical way to do this today, but you can accomplish it in PowerShell, and that link right there, learn how, that'll tell you exactly what to do. Now, if you enable this in the SharePoint Admin Center, it's going to automatically create a couple of conditional access policies. You can find these under the Azure Active Directory Admin Center under Security. And when you go and look at these, basically it creates two policies for this limited web-only access, and that's the first one we'll look at. What is it doing? It's two policies. The first one blocks the sync client, in other words, blocks modern apps from running unless you're on a managed device. And the second one limits the access for web browsers, in other words, blocks the download for web browsers. So one targets apps, one targets browsers. Taking a look at the first one, which applies to applications, the way the policy is structured is like this. First of all, they're targeting all users, so it's as broadly as possible. Like I said, it's a global setting. You can adjust this here too. If you wanted to start with a pilot group, you could certainly do that. As well, one cloud app will be selected. It'll be SharePoint Online. And then under conditions client apps, it's going to be selecting the modern authentication clients for you. And this refers to specifically the OneDrive client, but any client that supports modern authentication. And what this policy is going to say is basically you're granted access using a client application, but you have to have a managed device to do it. Now, if you selected browser here, that would also be true for browsers. So that's how you would, instead of having a separate policy that limits browser access, you could just have, that's what the other policy would look like. You just block access by selecting browsers here, and then you don't have a second policy, okay? So under access controls, how it looks is basically you're choosing that the device either has to be compliant, in other words, evaluated by Intune, a system that we manage, or it has to be joined to your domain, your legacy domain, and hybrid joined through that process, right? And then it's just saying like one of those two must be true, or you can't get access. So it implies that, yeah, access is granted, but it's also blocked if you can't meet this requirement, right? So that's how that's happening. And this applies, by the way, if you apply this to all users, it's also going to apply to guests. So that means like with this policies in place, guests would still have the web access and they'd be able to work, in your house. They'd be able to be invited into your house to do the work, but then they have to leave. They can't take the data with them. So fairly powerful.
Alex, do you have one audience question?
Okay.
It sounds like I have some feedback. I'm sorry. Is this type of external sharing HIPAA compliant?
This type of external sharing, I guess that's not clear what they were referring to. This type, anonymous would not be for HIPAA data for ePHI. You would, for anything that's ePHI, you would have to enforce, like at least new and existing guests where the person can be authenticated. And then as long as they can be authenticated and prove that they are who they say they are, then you would be in compliance so that you can say I shared this with this person specifically. So yeah, and then so with regard to this policy here, this is the second policy which targets web browsers. So under conditions, instead of selecting modern clients, we're just selecting web browsers. And then under the access control, we're not trying to grant or block access. Instead, we're trying to limit it. So for that, we use session instead of grant. And under here, there's a setting called use the app enforced restrictions, which just enforces that policy that we made in SharePoint when we check the little checkbox. It basically just says, listen to what SharePoint or OneDrive is telling you here. It's saying block download if it can't identify itself positively. And then I just want to draw your attention to a couple other ones that a lot of folks may be interested in. You can also choose to control the sign-in frequency. So how often do people have to authenticate or re-authenticate? So you might put a timeout on it, like 8 hours or something, whatever you want. As well, you can control that persistent browser session prompt. This is that prompt you might see when you first sign in to 365 and it's like, hey, do you want to stay signed in? And you have to pick yes or no. And it's just a matter of like, if you pick no, you might be prompted a little more frequently. Like if you close your browser and go back in, you might have to re-authenticate versus, if you say yes, I want to stay signed in, then it'll it'll have a little more trust with you or whatever. And you can make that choice for users so they don't see that prompt. And a lot of people are really happy to hear that they can do that because it is sort of annoying to get prompted all the time. Okay, here's what it looks like in practice. If you go into OneDrive, or this would also apply to SharePoint or even Teams, it'll give this banner up at the top and it says, hey, your organization doesn't allow you to download, print, or sync. And you'll notice there's no sync option along the top banner at all. I can create some files, I can maybe upload some files into this repository, but I can't download them. There's no download button, there's no sync button, right? As well, if you go to open the file, it doesn't allow you to open it in the application because that means it has to bring a copy down to your device, even as a temp copy, right? And it doesn't allow you to do that. You have to edit it in the browser so it stays, again, in your house. So you can't maybe do your full work, but you can still work, and that's the point. Is like you can still get stuff done, you can still collaborate with folks, but there's some boundaries on it. And then especially for there may be some people in your organization, like in their OneDrive, they've got a bunch of EPHI or PII or something. You may need to enforce that kind of thing for OneDrive. You may need to enforce that kind of thing for specific libraries in SharePoint, or you may decide to just do it globally, just depending on your requirements. All right, hopefully that made sense for everyone. We're moving through these at a good clip here. The next topic that we're going to touch on is mobile application management. This is really where things are going for mobility, especially because the majority of, especially in the small and mid-sized market, right, they're not corporate devices, they're personal devices. And the funny thing is I've even had organizations where they've done like a corporate device program where they purchase devices and manage them and given them to users to use. But the funny thing is they still end up being more personal than corporate. And even like they've reported to me that like, when it's time for the person to get terminated or something, it's actually kind of awkward that you have to like take this phone away from them. It's like their device, it's become their device. They've got family photos on there and stuff. And so it's kind of created this weird conundrum where it's like the trend is definitely toward more and more BYOD, even for people who try to do a corporate program. Now, there may still be certain situations where you've got corporate devices, especially like schools and stuff where you're issuing iPads to lots of people and you want to manage the whole device, and that makes total sense. But for the most part in the small business, we're talking about BYOD devices. And so Microsoft does provide this really good option for us. You don't have to manage the device, you can just manage the data. Okay. What does that look like? Well, remember this area in the OneDrive Admin Center? I always see people playing around and turning this stuff on because it all sounds good. Like, yeah, block downloading files, block, printing, require a passcode. So they're turning this stuff on, but they're really only targeting OneDrive. It's not applying to anything else. Well, that's why we don't use this. We use, you can also do it through here, through the Admin Center. There's actually going to be one other place we look at, but we'll start with this. This is a very easy way to turn on the policies in a little bit more robust way. You can create them and target them toward either Android or Apple devices. You'll want to make at least one policy for each. And you'll notice here that it can force users to save these work files. Number one, they have to be encrypted on the device. And number two, you have to save them in the OneDrive app. You can't get outside of that. It doesn't let you, like if you have an attachment in your Outlook email, you have to save it back into a managed location. You can't save it to the device. You can't save it to some other app like Dropbox or something. As well, you can require like a PIN, to get into the app, or they can, bypass this with a fingerprint or Face ID if they have that capability, blocking jailbroken devices and so forth. And the other really powerful thing here that is highly valuable is to kind of put a wall up around the application data so that it's not even possible to, like, say, copy and paste content into other places. Like, you can share it amongst the managed apps, but you can't share it outside of that. But you'll notice that, there's actually not very many applications down below there. So this isn't the only place where this policy lives. This is just a simplified interface or a quick way that you can kind of get started with these policies. And I encourage that if you're kind of a beginner or you're one of those accidental IT admins or something. But these correspond to this area in Intune in the Endpoint Manager under Apps, App Protection Policies. And so this is where you'll want to show up, and you'll probably want to take a look through here because you can include more applications. And there's a lot more to choose from, including some third-party that are supported. As well, you can add the new Office Hub app, and that's a highly valuable app. I recommend you check that out if you haven't already. It's basically Office for mobile devices, and it allows you to eliminate other apps, so you don't have to have Word, PowerPoint, Excel, OneDrive app all installed. You could remove all those apps and just put the Office app on, and you have access to all your files. And if you open one of them, it just opens like it opens in PowerPoint, it opens in Word right through one app. And so that makes it a little bit easier. It has some other cool features too, like where you can sign PDF files and stuff, you know, and that's highly valuable. The other big thing that is a huge request from a lot of folks is that there are cases where you put that application wall up and you're not allowing data to move outside, corporate data to move outside to other places. But there's certain times where you may want to do that, right? Like maybe you've got an address in your email and you're trying to share that data out to Apple Maps so you can get directions to your next appointment. And maybe not so much right now during lockdown and everything, but in the normal world, when we get back to normal, you'll want this capability. And so you can make exceptions like that and others if you need to share corporate data out to an application that's not, you know, quote, manageable. You can't wrap that boundary around it with this policy, but you still may want to be able to let some data flow. And so you can make exceptions in these policies. You can't do that through those other simplified interfaces. And there's going to be some other stuff. So just go in there and poke around. You can look at some of the other settings. I just drew attention to the most important ones. Keep going here. Again, in review, don't use the OneDrive Admin Center to deploy this policy. You can use the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. It's okay, but you'll get the most control and the most, you know, buttons and dials and stuff using Endpoint Manager. Oh, but wait, there's more. You can't. We're not actually done yet. So on the one hand, you can deploy these policies and it's really cool because you're protecting all the data in these apps, but a user could easily just get around those controls by using an outside app, right? Like they could just go to use like the default mail app in Apple Mail or Android or something. Now, if you want to force people down the path of using the managed apps so that they can't escape the MAM policies, we use conditional access again. Again, this is where you can see this is a key feature, a key way of controlling your security and compliance in the cloud. So from the Endpoint Manager, you can get to conditional access from Endpoint Security. And again, we're just going to target all users. The cloud apps will pick Office 365, and that applies to all the apps, including Exchange Online and SharePoint and OneDrive and Teams and all that stuff. Then under device platforms, you can only select iOS and Android because those are the only platforms that support MAM. All right, the only applications, or sorry, the only platforms that are going to support the access control here, which is require approved client app. And basically it just does exactly what it sounds. You have to use a managed app. You can't use the non-managed, read non-Microsoft. And what it looks like from an end user perspective, like here I am on my iOS device, I tried to add my account you know, to a non-approved application like the default mail app, and I get a warning, sorry, the dreaded conditional access prompt. You can't get there from here. You'll have to do something different. And so similarly, you know, if you're enforcing the control, right, require the device to be more compliant, or you know, Azure AD joined or something, they would get a similar prompt where it's like, hey, you're not on the right kind of stuff. You need to be managed, or you need to have an approved app, or whatever. So you'll see similar prompts to this if you're using conditional access. It usually means there's something you have to do differently in order to get access to that resource. All right, auditing access. I do kind of wish they had some better like pre-canned reports. I mean, there's some good third-party tools out there that you know, will help you manage data a little bit better. ShareGate, AppPoint, some of the big players out there. And you know, I'd recommend looking into that if you want to get some more detailed reports. You can also get a lot of this information. Like if I want to see, like I want to know who are my top storage users in OneDrive for Business. Well, in Microsoft 365, you can go through and click on every individual user. It's not very time efficient. There's not like a report I can pull, unfortunately, today. But there's third-party tools out there that would help you do that, and as well, you can get that information using PowerShell. But with regard to auditing access, you know, you might not have as many rich reports as you want, but you can find almost any information you want with queries against the Unified Audit Log. Now, I like to show this area in the OneDrive Admin Center only because under their compliance, it's sort of a nice little checklist. Even though all these links just basically bring you back to the Security and Compliance Center, auditing is the very first one, so we'll start there and look at that. But there's also data loss retention, you know, data loss prevention, retention, e-discovery, and so forth. We'll talk about all those things, but I just want to stay with auditing first. So under the Security and Compliance Center, you'll go down to search in the audit log search, and if this is the first time you've visited this area, in the upper right corner, pay attention. There may be a button that's like, hey, you need to turn this on in order to use it. And so it's not on by default. You have to turn on this unified audit log search so that the data from that's being logged in Exchange and SharePoint and all these places flows through to one place where you can kind of crawl across all of it. And once you turn it on, it does take a couple of hours. It's not just going to be available instantly. Just be aware of that. Then once you turn it on, you'll have the ability to search, and you can search all kinds of activities, like almost any activity you can imagine someone doing, you'll have access to. And so I've just got a few here that selected, like, you know, I'm on a detect when a file has been marked as a record, or there's been a deletion or something. You know, whatever events that you find interesting that you want to know, you know, what's happened in the last few days, and you can pick a date range and stuff and return the results. Now, the other thing that is highly powerful here is that you can create this alert policy. So whenever you have a query that you've defined as particularly interesting, like there's certain activities that you're super interested in watching, like maybe you want to watch the outgoing files. You know, I want to watch when people are sharing externally. I want to know when people are using those anonymous links or when people are using secure links even. You can bundle those into an alert policy so that you can receive notifications when those things happen in the future, and it preserves them in an audit trail in like a compliance mailbox, for example. So here is an example where, you know, files that have been downloaded or shared or accessed externally, you know, I'm logging that stuff to a compliance mailbox. Now, the reason that's important is that, you know, the audit log, by default, it keeps data for 90 days. That is extendable to 365, but not beyond that today. And so if you wanted to keep stuff for, say, years, especially specific events that you find highly interesting, then you may want to have a mailbox where you preserve those, you know, quote unquote, interesting events. And this is a good way of doing that. As well, it's a good way for a compliance officer to monitor certain, you know, interesting activity. So far we've reviewed a few key things, and this is going to that checklist. At the end, we'll have a link to the complete checklist, but we're just taking this in pieces right now. Try to keep it a little more digestible, and I'm trying to get through a lot of stuff in 2 hours, so hopefully I'm not boring you too much. Okay, we reviewed the SharePoint and OneDrive organizational settings, like the sharing settings and the one-time passcode and things like that. You can choose, right, if you have a lower risk concern, you could choose to allow anyone links. You can consider using an expiration date on anyone links to control that a little bit, maybe also enabling a one-time passcode option for guests. If you have a little bit of a higher risk concern, you're dealing with sensitive data on a global scale, you may choose to drop that down to new and existing guests. You may want to block all external sharing, you know, but that's only if there's never a situation where you're going to collaborate with someone outside of your org. And, you know, we talked about the audit log and creating some alert policies and enabling the audit log search. Be sure you always do that at least at the very minimum. Access control for unmanaged devices, right? Be sure you always block legacy authentication, but you can go further than that with limited web-only access or just blocking access outright. You can control session timeout settings and so on and so forth. And then, of course, you know, protecting data on the mobile devices, especially mobile devices that you can't control or outside of your control. You can just control the data. Why control the whole device when you can get control of the stuff you care about the most? So next up, we'll dive a little bit into this data governance topic. This is actually, we have a whole other you know, user group that we held on this. I don't believe that one was recorded, but if you've been attending the user groups in the past, you did see my entire presentation. You'll see a little bit of repeat here, but I'm going to go through this a little bit more quickly. So the things we'll touch upon are data loss prevention, sensitivity labels, and data retention. And with regard to data loss prevention, the first tool that we'll talk about with regards to this governance idea, Microsoft has a bunch of sort of predefined data types that they know how to look for, patterns that they know how to look for. And you'll note that you can also create your own custom patterns, like if you've got, like, you know, corporate terms that are used, like Project Phoenix or something, and that's like refers to a secret project you're working on. That's considered confidential information. You don't want it getting out. Like, you can create your own identifiers if you want to, but there's already some pre-built ones for you if you need to, you know, adhere to certain laws like HIPAA or FERPA or FINRA, FedRAMP, or any of those things. and for multiple countries too. So like GDPR will be in here and so forth under like privacy. So a lot of things to choose from to get you started. And the options are pretty simple. I mean, there's actually a few more options this, but I want to keep it simple and then just talk about the major ones. So obviously you can show policy tips and send email notifications to users when they're sharing sensitive info and just like kind of give them some guidance on doing it responsibly. You can also have an incident report, right? This is similar to the alert policy idea where you send it to a compliance mailbox, you're preserving that trail. You may be required by some laws, like HIPAA, for example, does require you to preserve a trail or a record of when you shared data that could be considered EPHI, PII, and so forth. You need to have that recorded so that you can, when you're audited, you can go back and say, yes, this is legit, this is why this was shared, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if there's an incident where it was shared and you shouldn't have been, there may be some things you need to do to follow up and close the loop on that. Okay, but the point is that if you don't want to be in a situation where they come and audit you and you're like, I don't know, I don't have a record of that stuff. Like, it's good to at least have the record so that that already shows that you're managing it to a certain level. So incident reports are something that I highly recommend that you start with. And then of course you can also restrict access. Like, you can just block certain things from getting shared. You can encrypt email messages. And by the way, even though we're kind of focusing on like OneDrive and SharePoint and file sharing and stuff, obviously this applies in Teams as well. So this, you can apply DLP rules, to any files. That also applies to files that live in Teams. You can apply it to chat messages and stuff in Teams. It works a little differently than it does in email because in an email it can actually block it as it goes through the transport service on the way out the door. It'll say like, oh, this isn't allowed to go out, and it'll block it. It'll send the rejection message. But in Teams it'll actually get sent, then the processing will happen, and then they'll pull it back. So it looks a little different in Teams. Just be aware of that. Now, usually I find when I'm consulting with organizations that they don't necessarily know, unless they're working in an industry where they know exactly the kind of data they're working with, and they're sending stuff to the Department of Defense, and they know who they're supposed to share and not supposed to share that information with. A lot of organizations don't really know. Like, I don't know, how often are social security numbers being shared or any other PII or anything? I'm not sure. I don't know what we use that for. And they might not be aware that there are processes in place that they need to be able to share that data out sometimes to specific partner organizations or to specific authorities or whatever. And so I usually recommend starting with incident reports and monitoring that for a period of time before you decide to take other access, so you can understand the data in your environment. This goes with, if you're following any kind of major cybersecurity framework like NIST, for example, this goes with the identify stage. And usually before you can get to protect, before you can adequately protect something or apply the correct protections and controls, you need to understand what you're dealing with, right? So you need to identify first. And that's why I always say, look, start with incident reports if you don't know what else to do. That's going to raise your visibility. Now you have information. Now you have something that you can react to, okay? Then you can decide how you want to control it after that. All right, next up, sensitivity labels. So this is actually a really powerful feature. Oh, by the way, I say like here, I say, oh, they're almost there. It's like, they're not quite what I want them to be yet, but they're getting there. They're so close. They're so close. But we'll talk about them because I think they're going to be highly valuable and highly important in the future. So if you never used them before, this feature literally just became available like within the last couple months here. So we've had labels for a long time, but we haven't had the ability to view those labels, especially encrypted labels, labels that apply encryption to content. What that does is it destroys the collaboration features in Microsoft 365 because SharePoint literally can't read encrypted data, or couldn't in the past. They just fixed that. So if you come in here, you can turn that on, and that will allow SharePoint to like search the data, right? So now it's searchable, and you can find it with DLP rules and things like this, and e-discovery. So if you want to work with those kinds of experiences in the cloud, which is what makes 365 so great, and you want to use sensitivity labels together, you've got to turn this on. Unfortunately, like in today's iteration of this, it does enable some good collaboration and searching and all that, and the co-authoring works, but it only works like if you're working in the apps online. So you can pull them down if you want to, you can download a copy and work with it in your Word or whatever. But if you've got people that are trying to work with it in the desktop apps and work with it in the web apps, that's still clunky, okay? And you're still going to run into issues there. And they make a note of that. They kind of give you a warning about it or whatever. But where we really want it to be is everything just works flawlessly, right? We just want there to be, perfect usability on the web, perfect usability in the desktop apps, and it doesn't matter where you're accessing it, everything works great. It's not quite there, but it's getting there. And it's a lot further than it was before, where if you put an encrypted file in SharePoint, it can't even search that data. So it's definitely come a long way. Now, if you don't have these labels yet, it's really easy to get started with them, okay? You can generate them from the Azure Information Protection portal. Just click on that button right up there, and it'll bring you to the portal. Click on Labels on the left, and then Generate Default Labels up top. So this is a good way to get started. You can create your own custom labels too. Know that, you can do that, but just get started with the default ones, just so you get a sense for how they work. And honestly, this is probably all that a lot of organizations will need. These are the same labels that Microsoft uses internally. Now, the first thing to notice about these labels is that the order matters. So if you are going to create some adjustments in here and you're going to create your own labels, be sure you drag them into the proper hierarchy, the proper place. The reason is because part of the policy, when you publish these labels, part of the policy is that you can ask users to justify their reason for downgrading a label so that that gets written into your compliance log, right? So if they decide like, oh, this isn't confidential, this should be, you know, general or public or something, and they're downgrading the label, the way that Microsoft knows that you've downgraded to a lower level of classification, a lower level of sensitivity, is that it's in this literally numbered order right here. So be sure you put it in the correct order when you create your labels. As well, after you've got all your labels, you might be like, where are they? You actually have to publish them, so be sure to click Publish Labels, and that will create a label policy. You'll just step through a wizard where you basically choose the labels you want to publish and who you want to publish them to. So it is also possible to have multiple label policies where you're publishing some labels to some sets of users, some labels to others. You know, I just have, you know, in the basic setup, you can just take the labels that are default and just publish them to everybody. You may make, you know, a couple of small adjustments, like some people don't think there should really be a personal label. It doesn't really, personal, all that means is non-business, by the way, so it's not, and it doesn't really guarantee privacy or anything like that. So if that is confusing for you or your end users, you might consider like maybe making some small adjustments. But for the most part, these are really handy labels to go, and we'll go through them. What it looks like in Word is, or Excel or any of the apps basically is like this. There'll be this big sensitivity button. You just click it and you'll pick which label you want, and that can apply various things. And so in this example, I've modified the template so that there's a watermark that says confidential. So if I pick confidential, it literally gets stamped confidential. As well, in the confidential label, we have the ability to encrypt so that basically, like, it's not possible now to take this document and bring it to some other place and let someone else open it. Like, you have to be a member of the organization to get into it. You have to sign in to the app in order to read this data and decrypt it. So that's how that works. Now, an important thing to note about licensing: you can manually label documents all day long with the business subscription and the E3 subscriptions. Okay, but if you want to automatically label stuff based on, like, hey, this has a credit card number in it, I want to find that and just automatically label it. Or I want to, when I open a file, it's going to say, hey, I suggest that you mark this as whatever because I found, you know, these keywords. If you want to have that kind of functionality, that's E5, and it's actually technically it's part of Azure Information Protection Plan 2, so you can use that add-on as well, but it's bundled in the E5 package. So just to go through these default sensitivity labels, obviously we talked about personal. It just means non-business data. If you mark it, it just means like it's not really public, it's not business related, it's just something that you're working on. But it doesn't also guarantee that, it doesn't make it like, it doesn't cover that data up so that your employer can't see it or anything like that. It's just means non-business, just a way of flagging it. Public information is specifically prepared and approved for public consumption. So you may have things that they're made to go out to the public, they're made to be shared, and that's what that label means. General, some people like to call this internal. You could also just rename this label internal if you wanted to, but this is business data that's okay to use for external collaboration, maybe with approved partners or something, but it's not really intended for public consumption. Then we get into confidential, which is basically like, this isn't really supposed to be shared externally at all. And in fact, maybe it could cause damage to the business. You know, it's like trade secrets or something, or it's like HR data, or, you know, things just don't belong outside the four walls. And then there's just like highly confidential that shouldn't be shared widely, maybe even with other people in the organization, you know, maybe with a tighter group of individuals. And so what are the powers that these labels have? by default, there's really no markings or encryption involved in any of the first 3 labels. It's just a way of classifying information. And in the latter 2, confidential and highly confidential, the default behavior is to apply some footer markings to it, and as well, basically to apply some encryption so that you can choose. There's actually a couple subcategories of the confidential label. You can say like recipients only if you're sending an email or something like that, and that means that only the people that you've included in your subject line are going to have access to the attachments and the message and stuff that you sent out. Or you can use org-wide, which basically means, I'm applying an org-wide setting here. So anybody in the you could forward this around, anybody in the organization or anyone in the organization could find this file and open it. But even if that person accidentally forwarded it to someone else outside the company or, left it on a USB stick somewhere sitting around, and that file wouldn't be readable by anyone who couldn't sign into your org. Okay. So that's the behavior of the default labels. And yes, you can make custom ones. So for example, like maybe you have like an accounting department, you could create a subcategory under confidential that's like confidential/accounting. And now your encryption applies just to those specific people and only they can open it, right? That's the idea.
Alex, we have another user question.
Sure.
Can you use the sensitivity feature for Adobe PDFs or just Microsoft products?
Yeah, that's a good question. It is possible to apply it to PDFs, and there's actually a setting in the in Outlook Web Access. So if you're, let's say, attaching, let's say you're using email to send a PDF, and you wanted to apply the encryption to both the message itself as well as the attachment. The way that you accomplish that is through PowerShell today, and so there's a switch that you can set that says also encrypt PDFs or something. That will apply the encryption to the PDF as well. There is a client that you can download for your computer called the Azure Information Protection Client. And once you have that client installed in your file explorer, you can right click on any file and just go to like classify and protect. And you'll see your labels and you'll be able to apply the label that you want to the files you want. So yeah, that's a good question. Some files aren't supported. It won't support every file type, but Adobe does have a partnership with Microsoft that allows them to do that. So. Now, coming soon, this isn't available today. The first one is actually just through a preview, but again, it's not there yet, so I wouldn't recommend using this in production. But you'll be able to classify not based on a file, but on group, team, or a site, like a SharePoint site. And it doesn't do what you think it does. By the way, it doesn't, as of today anyways, in the preview. If you apply it to, say, a team, it doesn't just go apply that label to every file in that team. Instead, it's applying a setting on that team that might have other capabilities. Like if you mark a team confidential, it might mean you cannot invite an external user into that team, for example. It might mean you can't access that team from an unmanaged device, right? So it provides some of those other controls, but it doesn't apply the same label to every file. So that can be a little bit confusing to folks, but that is because it'll be the same sensitivity label, but it has different powers depending on your context, whether you're in the document or in the team. They've had some feedback. I've been at some of the events and stuff where a lot of people are asking for that. Like, can you give me at least the option in the label where it's like, if I apply this to a team or a site, just apply it to all the subfiles and stuff. And we'll see if they take that to heart. I don't know. But as of right now, it's not how it works. As well, this is supposed to be coming soon. I don't have a specific ETA. I think it might be by like the end of this year or something, but integration with DLP rules. Okay, and so this is actually, you'd think that this already exists today, but you can already create DLP rules where it's like finding stuff based on like, oh, there's a credit card number or a social security number or something, and we're going to protect data that, and not allow it to go out or file an incident report. But you can also you'll also be able to do that based on a label. So if you have data that's labeled confidential or even data that's labeled internal, right? Maybe it's just labeled, this is internal, now you can create some policy tips around that to kind of guide users about the use of that data. You could file incident reports or apply a certain encryption to it if you're sharing it externally, whatever you want to do. So as of today, can't do it, but it's coming soon. And then the last thing, obviously, this is I really don't have any solid dates for this, but we'd like to see more and more improvements to the co-authoring experiences for the web and the desktop so that you can use everything seamlessly. And that's the dream right there. So as we keep moving into the future, these are going to get more and more powerful. I think more and more common. Really good way to protect information because again, it's traveling with the file. It doesn't matter whether you have a managed device, unmanaged device. It doesn't matter. None of that comes into play. It's literally protecting the data itself. And if you open that data, you know, on some device that the organization has no idea about, you're just going to be prompted to sign in. And if you've got multi-factor and stuff, obviously you're going to have a high level of protection there. So very cool. Retention policies and labels. All right, this is the idea is just like keep what you want, get rid of what you don't. As well, it's a good way to manage your storage because you only get so much storage allotment in SharePoint. It's actually one of the worst deals out there in some ways. I mean, you know, a lot of the other storage providers like Dropbox, ShareFile, you know, G Suite and so forth will provide more storage for less money than SharePoint does. In the enterprise, this doesn't usually end up being a big problem because how it works is you get a terabyte for a pooled storage amount in any subscription, then you get 10 gigabytes per licensed user. Well, if you've got like 5,000 people in your company, you've got like, you know, 50 terabytes of space or something. That's a crazy amount of storage space. You're probably fine. But in the small and mid-sized business, you know, even if you've got like 100 users, that's only another terabyte. And so now you only have 2 terabytes to work with, you know. So it's not, you know, it's maybe not that great. And so you do need to be cognizant of the storage space that you're consuming in the cloud, and you do want to manage that. And it's a good idea to expire data that hasn't been touched in a few years. You know, I mean, what is the purpose of it? It's clutter. If you're not using it, you don't need it, and it's not subject to some kind of compliance requirement where you need to keep it. Just get rid of it. You know. So you know how this looks. There's 2 different things you can use: labels, which I've got kind of along the top row there, and then retention policies, which are sort of represented in the bottom. But basically a typical document lifecycle is, you know, you'll create content and you'll be collaborating on it for a while. And during this time, you know, you can have versioning, you can restore to previous versions and stuff like that. If you'd accidentally delete it, you can get it back from the recycle bin, whatever. But at some point you're done working on that file and it moves and becomes a record. Now it's a record for the business. And especially if it's an important record, like it's a legal document that's been signed and it's memorializing something or whatever, you know, you may need to apply a label to it so that it starts being preserved. What that does is it writes a copy that's immutable into the preservation library. All right, and it's going to hold it for however long you told the label to hold it for. So even if you delete it out of the primary library, it's not going anywhere. It's going to be available in the preservation library for all of time. And then at the end of that period, you can have it either go up for disposition review, where someone gets an email notification and they have to go and review the content and decide whether it should get let go or whether they want to keep it a little longer, or just automatically delete it. Now, retention policy doesn't have that disposition review option, and in general, retention policies don't really apply to individual like files and folders and stuff. You're targeting broad locations like you know, all of SharePoint, all of OneDrive, all of Exchange, or whatever. So generally speaking, you keep these fairly short if you're using them. You will say something like, you know, we want to preserve data in general for at least 2 years or 3 years or whatever. But we're not trying to keep like 7 years of all our data because that's going to get expensive fast, right? Now, this blanket retention, you know, that's usually going to be a shorter duration than the label, right? So again, preservation always wins over deletion. So even if your general data retention policy is, hey, we get rid of anything, we get rid of our email that's older than 3 years. And a lot of folks actually want to do that. They want to get rid of that to manage not only their storage space, but also liability and stuff like that. So they will have policies in place that clear stuff out. But there are certain pieces of data, right, that you work with that are considered, you know, under compliance requirements or whatnot, and you need to preserve them longer. Well, that's okay. You just apply a label to those things, and they outlast the general data protection policy that's cleaning house on stuff. But it is also optional. You don't have to delete stuff after the end of your retention policy. It's just a possibility. So we're actually looking at settings for a label here, where you get the option for like disposition and review and all that. They are applied again to the individual files. You can apply them to lists or libraries, you know, so you can apply them like at a whole SharePoint library. You can just be like, you get this label and everything in here just inherits that label. If you then decide to take a file in that library and label it something else, that's okay. You can do that. You can override the default label, so to speak, and the more specific one always wins. But the policies, of course, only target broad locations. So they don't work like labels do, and they can't really trigger a disposition review, but you can just essentially say, you know, keep data for this long, delete it or not at the end. You know, however you want. And Some other points about this, again, similar to sensitivity labels. You only get manual labeling if you've got the business and E3 plans. You want that automatic labeling based on, triggering it based on some kind of rule or something when it finds certain content. That's again an E5 feature. So it's normally recommended to start with at least a data protection policy that's, target each app like OneDrive. OneDrive might get longer. Maybe you protect OneDrive for like 5 years or something, who knows? But that's a lot more storage per user than, all of SharePoint. You might protect it for like a year. So you can, like, if a file's accidentally deleted and you don't realize it for 3 months, you can still go and get it back, or 4 months or something, that kind of thing. All right, so you can find this both in the old Security and Compliance Center and the new Compliance Center. You can find this under Information Governance Retention, and you can create policies. Here I've created a policy, one for each app. I like doing it that way. You'll notice that if you try to create a Teams retention policy for chat and channel messages, it doesn't let you bundle that with other things anyway. So I'm, why not just separate everything by app? And you may want different lengths of time depending on whether you're dealing with email, whether you're dealing with chat messages, whether you're dealing with files, because those are all very different types of data, right? So you may want to split them out anyway. So when you create your retention policy, you'll go through a little wizard and you just pick the locations that you want this to apply to. So that's what I would recommend doing. And in review, this is kind of the checklist. None of these things are on by default, and no one's going to tell you about them unless you go looking for it. So highly valuable, especially with regards to compliance or if you have security concerns around specific types of information or whatnot. Oh, one more thing I want to point out about retention policies. Interestingly, they can be used with DLP. So DLP can look for retention label today and flag based on retention label, but it can't yet with sensitivity, which should be coming soon. All right, how are we looking for time here? Oh, we're totally on time. We're gonna have time at the end for more questions, which is perfect. Okay, so the last thing we'll talk about is Teams, and this is actually, I'm gonna be honest, like I didn't know how much I could cover here, and there's so many ways you can customize Teams, and we're not gonna get into all of it by any means. And this is not meant to be a, here's all the things you can do to customize the user experience of Teams. But I do want to touch on some of the more important ones, especially the ones that where people bring it up, bring up concerns related to, security and compliance, the things I'm really comfortable with, right? When it comes to the user experience stuff, it's very flexible. We can do a lot of things, but yeah, I won't get into all the weeds there. So what about Teams? First of all, if you've configured some of that access control and sharing rules for OneDrive and SharePoint, you're already covered with Teams because Teams just uses SharePoint repositories to share files. So you're already 3 steps ahead. Now, when you get into Teams itself, probably the most common thing that we hear about is like who can create Teams and can we restrict that? And so we'll talk about that a little bit. As well, there's questions around, should we allow people to chat with others outside the organization? Should we talk about, what about guest access? And then last is application control, because there's so many third-party apps that integrate with Teams. And how do you control that? Like a lot of those apps are outside of your compliance boundary, right? Like you don't have visibility into a lot of those things. Like how do you manage this? So we'll talk about all this. First of all, who can create Teams? This is for the control freaks out there. I can say this because I'm myself a little bit of a control freak. So I'm not making fun of you. You're my people. But when it comes to creating Teams, I generally encourage folks to let users create their own teams. Now, that doesn't mean there's not legitimate reasons to take that capability away, especially if like you're just trying to become better users of Teams, right? So sometimes when you first start using Teams, people don't really understand what it's for. They'll just create teams left and right, and they don't really get that they could just have created a team and then multiple channels under a team or something. So sometimes you may want to like restrict it in the beginning and then get people their digital passports, right? Once you've earned your digital passport and now you're trained up on Teams and we have a good understanding of how we're going to use Teams in our organization, now we'll release this capability so that it's easier for you to provision some new resources, do your job as you see fit, but we're not just going to have a free-for-all right out of the gate. I think that's a totally legitimate reason, as long as you're working towards the whole point of having an application like this is so that your users aren't going out and trying to find third-party ways of sharing files and collaborating with others and holding meetings and stuff. You want to give them a platform that you manage and you control, but you want them to be able to use it. If they can't use it, they're just going to go somewhere else, right? So anyway, this is what it looks like when you take the option to create a team away. It just doesn't show up for a user. And you might still have some people, obviously, who are in that group of folks who are allowed to provision some of the first teams that you start working with. And the only way to accomplish that is in PowerShell. So there's this script from Microsoft, and it'll be linked in the deck here. So when we send the deck out, you'll be able to find this. Very easy to do. You just basically elect a security group that contains people who will have the ability, and then it just gets turned off for everyone else. And so it is possible to do, but just know that like part of the whole point of having Teams and having the Microsoft 365 platform is to enable that self-service aspect. And so there's definitely value in having it on, but it makes sense that you may want to, take a soft adoption route with it, so to speak. All right, external chat and guest access. Okay, now like email, Teams lets you communicate and collaborate with people outside your organization, but unlike email, it's actually made for collaboration. Like email wasn't really designed for file sharing, right? But that's how people use it. But when you're chatting with people, you can share files, and it's really just using links in your OneDrive and stuff like that. So it's highly valuable. Now, on the other hand, it's also a legitimate choice to say, look, if you want to use if you want to communicate with people externally, we're for the most part going to be using email, and maybe we can invite them to a team as a guest, but we're not going to have you chatting. That's totally legit. You can just turn it off. You can just come in here and turn these things off, and then they can't chat with users who are outside on Skype or Teams in other orgs. And so that's a legitimate choice. You can also restrict it by domain. So you can, for example, populate specific domain. You can say like, oh, these domains are allowed to communicate. That's a whitelist approach. Or you can block specific domains that you don't want to allow communication with. For guest access, this is actually off by default, interestingly. But if you ever want to be able to, invite someone who's not in your org into your org to collaborate on something, to have conversations with and chat with and share files with and so forth, maybe share a calendar with or something, then you're going to want to bring them into Teams, and you'll want to have this on. And unfortunately, there's not like you can't restrict it by domain like you can with chat, so it's like all or nothing. It's either on or off. So you can turn it on. You'll get a few more options that you can look at once you dial that in. I'll let you do that on your own time. And now I do want to take a look at some of the meeting settings and policies that you have with regard to meeting, how you can control the experience of your virtual meetings. So under the meetings area, you've got meeting settings and meeting policies. And I can't go through every single option here, just given the time, but I want to touch on some of the more important ones, or some of the ones that I should say maybe we get asked about often. So the transcription feature, a lot of people have heard of the transcription feature, but they don't know why it's not working. You do have to turn it on. It's not on by default. And it doesn't work perfectly. You'll notice like it still will, misinterpret some of the things that people have said and recorded incorrectly. But it still can be valuable as a way of, searching through the video to find something that maybe when your name was mentioned or whatever, maybe you've got a follow-up item. That kind of thing. And as well, you can kind of turn on the transcription where you can get subtitles. So it'll, if you want to turn off your audio or something, you can still kind of read along. And so that's kind of valuable as well. You have to turn this on separately for meeting policies and event and live event policies, just to be aware. In addition, there's this really handy feature. I literally use this every day, screen sharing. So definitely within my organization and even outside my organization, sometimes when I have meetings with folks or I'm invited to collaborate with people, we are sharing screens with each other. We're showing things back and forth, and it's very frequent when you want to be able to let them take control. But by default, if they're an outside user, they don't get that option. You can't give a request control to somebody, but you can come turn that on. And so it's really handy to be able to have that. And so a lot of folks ask for it. Just be aware that it's there. Under the participants and guests area, you can control some of the experiences, like for example, the lobby experience, right? You probably have been familiar with this, where like you start a meeting, but the guests who are coming in get placed in the lobby by default. You can automatically admit people if you wanted to. You could even restrict this a little further or whatever, but you can control that lobby experience. And now there's another thing that I do have to draw your attention to, is this idea of anonymous users. Now, similarly to anonymous links in OneDrive and SharePoint, you can make it very easy to join meetings. And this is on by default, and this is actually makes it super easy. Like if you have a 365 account and you're already signed in, it's going to know who you are. So if you click the link and you're coming into a meeting, it's going to know who you are right away. For people who might not have a 365 account or a Microsoft account, it's not necessarily going to know who you are when you click that link, but it's going to allow you in because you're allowing anonymous users. That's probably fine, honestly, in so many situations, especially if you're like doing meeting recordings and stuff, because those users are identified in a way by their presence, and maybe if you're taking attendance before a board meeting or something, right? Like, you know who the people who are there are. But if you want it to be preserved in an audit log, and so that you know who they are and they have to be signed in with a Microsoft account to get the access, right? Then you can come turn this off. The situations where you really need that, I think, are probably lower than like exchanging, files and information and data and stuff, but just be aware that this is there. Okay, so now application control. This is actually a really huge topic in information security in general. And application control can refer to a lot of things, including things like application whitelisting and only letting certain applications run in your organization and so forth. But the whole thing is that, we have all these third-party apps that integrate, but how do you control that? Now, an example of this is cloud storage, right? If you go to any channel and click on the Files tab and click on Add Cloud Storage, you're going to get a whole list of menu options here. You can add other locations in SharePoint, which are managed locations, but you can also add Dropbox, Box, ShareFile, Google Drive. You can even add like personal versions of these, like I got a personal Google Drive and connect that up and share files into it. But then you're kind of encouraging people to use these storage locations, right, that you don't have any visibility into. So that may or may not work with the compliance requirements that you're subject to in your organization. And so it is possible to come turn those off. And under org-wide settings and team settings, you'll scroll down and find the files area here, and you will be able to turn off those third-party providers if you wanted to. As well, you could leave any on that you want to use, because maybe your company uses Dropbox. Maybe they have a Dropbox subscription that they're using and they need to connect that to Teams. That's cool. You should also know that it's possible to connect some of these more popular apps such as Box, Dropbox, G Suite, and so forth. You can connect those to Microsoft Cloud App Security. So if you do that, what that does is all of the security information, all the audit log data will flow back into your 365 environment, and it's auditable. You can control it with DLP and so forth, because it's really gonna end up proxying all that connection through the 365 universe on its way through, so that all that stuff can get logged. And it's so it's a highly valuable tool. Again, this is an E5 feature, but this is an add-on that's really inexpensive. It's like $350 per user for any other subscription. So if you do have outside, apps that you want to manage and monitor and have a good audit log of all the things happening, and you want to manage that centrally and start creating some rules and alerts around it, then consider Cloud App Security. Now, not all of the apps, obviously, I'll just go back. That's the whole list of apps right there, by the way. This is like all the apps that Cloud App Security supports. Granted, it's some major ones, but there's a whole bunch of other apps. Like there's like 500 some apps that connect to Teams right now, like out of their gallery. So you can't wrap cloud security around everything. The question is like, of these apps, how many of them represent, a risk per se? Which ones are riskier than others? Where might you be storing data that you could consider leaking outside of your compliance boundary? Maybe like you don't allow people to use Trello if you've got Planner and you can manage Planner internally, and you're worried about any kind of sensitive information creeping its way out into Trello, for instance. Well, you can do this as well. So you can come in to under the Teams Admin Center under Manage Apps, and you'll be able to select these apps, and you can allow or block them individually. You can also org-wide just turn them off wholesale. If you just want to work within the Microsoft universe and just say that's our policy, you have to work within the Microsoft universe, whatever. That's something. But I actually want to recommend another way besides just coming in and turning off, like throwing down the sledgehammer. And that is you can turn on application consent approvals. Right? How that works is this is found in the Azure Active Directory Admin Center. You'll come to Enterprise Applications and then User Settings. Look for the near the top. There'll be an option that says users can consent to apps accessing company data on their behalf. You want to switch this to no. So that means users can't just go provision their own apps. They can't like click on an app, say, yep, connect this to Teams. It's usually going to prompt them, hey, can this app come interact with Microsoft 365? And they have to say yes. And if you turn this off, they won't have that capability. Now down below, you want to also enable the feature that says admin consent requests. So flip this to yes. That means that users won't be able to just accept the permission themselves, but they'll say, do you want to request this app? And they can say, yeah, please send a notification to my admin or whatever. It'll go to the admin. You can choose who those people are, right? The people who are going to approve the requests. They'll get an email notification, and then they can come back into this portal under admin consent requests down here, and they can go approve the apps, review them, or approve them, or deny them as they see fit, right? Now, if you need to delegate, like global admins can do this by default, but if you need to delegate this role, you can find this under Azure Active Directory roles and administrators. Just click on application administrator and add whoever you need to that role so that they can be the approver, so to speak. And that way you're not just letting the floodgates open, but you're still allowing people to kind of go shopping, right? And you can decide, you know, is that acceptable? Like, could we see a situation where this is too risky, or is there another way we can manage that application? You know, it's also possible, right, to tie a lot of these applications to Azure Active Directory for single sign-on. So now all your sign-ons are protected with MFA or however you're doing that. So now you can have greater control of the app. So you can kind of make some decisions about the apps that you allow into the fold. All right, so we made it to the end. Again, there's so many other things, like for example, with regard to those apps, you know, you can even populate the left rail of Teams where, like, the, you know, you've got the different apps like Chat and Teams and things. You can populate that. You can customize how the app looks and feels and stuff with various apps. Like maybe you're using Adobe Sign and you have a little Adobe Sign like short link there that you can just click on or something. But I'm not going to go into all that. You know, I didn't know how much time we were going to have to get through everything, and I wanted to hit upon the ones that I felt were probably more important, you know, as regards to security and compliance and some of the stuff that I'm the most comfortable with talking about. And yeah, so just in review, you know, groups creation, certainly it's possible to restrict that. Guest access, generally speaking, you know, people usually want this on, honestly, because they do have scenarios where they can imagine, you know, inviting someone from not in their organization in to collaborate on something. So you should really only leave it disabled if you literally have never planned to use Teams that way. External chat, you know, this kind of, I see this go 50-50, honestly. Some people are fine having their users chat with outside folks. Other people would say rather just be like, you know, chatting is an internal thing, and email is more formal, and that's for external communication. That's also legit. Go either way on that, or you can restrict by domain, however you see fit. Teams and other settings, you know, that most organizations just accept it. They consume it like they consume other apps like Zoom or Dropbox or anything. They just provision Teams, they start using it, and the defaults are fine. But I would, you know, suggest review at least, you know, this anonymous meeting access question if that's a concern. Review the transcription features, the lobby experience, and things like that. The given request control, like that's, I use it every day. I would certainly recommend taking a look at it. And then with regard to application control, you know, I really like the admin consent request option. Yes, it's also possible to just disable applications outright. And, you know, you have other more advanced options like tying the apps back to Azure AD and Cloud App Security and starting to really get control of that audit data and stuff. So plenty of things that you can do to make the environment safer, make the environment a little bit easier to use. Yeah, so I think that basically wraps up the presentation. We'll have a link in the deck that goes out so that you can get the checklist, which I've just kind of taken all the pieces that we went through in parts, and I just compiled them into a document that you can refer to if you like. And I don't know, Vanessa, we got anyone else who had questions? Maybe we'll wait for a few minutes here and see if anyone wants to ask something.
Yeah, so for those who are still on, this is a great time to ask questions. We do have one who is asking about the portals you were using. They look a little different than what he sees.
Okay, yeah, I mean, so these portal, like the Azure Active Directory Admin Center, is a different area than you maybe are familiar with going to, but it's pretty easy to get there. So like from the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, again, you have to be an admin. From the Admin Center, you can click on Show More, and then down below one of the Admin Centers, or you can click on All Admin Centers, and you'll find Azure Active Directory. You can click on that, and that'll take you to the Azure AD portal. Similarly, you'll see other admin centers down there, like the SharePoint Admin Center, the OneDrive Admin Center, and so forth. and you can just click on each of those admin centers, and they each bring you to a slightly different experience. I mentioned in practice, I almost never use the OneDrive Admin Center for anything. I usually just use the SharePoint Admin Center because you get basically all the same controls plus a little more. And then the Azure AD Admin Center gives you then further functionality, like, for example, these admin consent requests can only be found here. And so, again, the deck is going out, so hopefully that will give you a little bit of a breadcrumb trail that you can follow, right? So that if you want to find your way to some of these things, and granted, over time this stuff goes up, but I literally just took these screenshots yesterday, so these are pretty up to date. And if you, over time they may change the look and feel slightly, but generally speaking, there's still going to be the same concepts will be available. They might just move things around a little bit. So just be aware of that.
Awesome, thank you. We have one more question. Can we restrict people from attaching documents to an email on a managed device instead of sharing?
Attaching documents on an email. Well, you could probably write like you wouldn't be able to prevent them from attaching it to an email, but you could prevent it from going out through the transport service using like a transport rule or something. So you could prevent certain email attachments or just attachments in general from leaving the organization or coming into the organization, for example. And yeah, I mean, links are honestly, I think more and more in the future, they'll be a preferred way. Sometimes an attachment is the right move. Like there are situations, right, where if maybe I just want to send a PDF document out and it's not editable or anything anyways, it's just a piece of information that I'm pushing out to somebody and they can just keep it and do whatever they want with it. It's a public document. It's not, that might be fine to do. But links for anything that you're trying to get feedback on, collaboration on, I would certainly recommend using links rather than attachments. So good question.
Thank you. Well, it looks like that's it for now. For those of you who joined late, we'll just reiterate that this event was recorded. So you will receive a link to the event recording in a post-event email, along with the presentation and the other resources that Alex has mentioned.
Perfect.
All right, well, thank you everyone for coming. Keep an eye out for that email, and we do have our end user group tomorrow morning from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. So if you have any end users in your organization that you would like to send to that, they can still register and join us tomorrow. That's it. Everyone have a great day. Thanks for joining us.
Perfect.